Hey.
broadcast.
Oh, okay.
Okay. Well, thank you so much for joining us.
Well,
We
it's a
really
great
enjoyed
pleasure.
your book.
It's a great pleasure to join you, and I feel very honoured that you've all read my book.
Oh, well, we were thrilled. I think we had some questions for today, and I don't want to dominate the discussion, so I'm going to just ask the students to pass the mic around to whoever wants to uh, talk at the moment, okay?
Okay.
So who wants to start us off with a question? Good.
Hi, I'm Vera.
Hi,
Um,
Vera.
it's nice to meet you. Um, Throughout your book, you had a lot of references towards birds. Um,
Mm.
I personally don't know what the connection between the birds and um, Maggie and the little boy have together. So, is was there some sort of connection that I didn't see that
Yeah.
had?
Well, it's a really interesting question because I think there's one answer to that which is very literal, which is that in this area of Caithness, the birds are very prominent. It's an incredibly sparsely populated area from the human point of view, but there's a lot of birds, and it's something that I was very aware of as a newcomer um, to the place when I was exploring it, and I felt that it was something that Maggie would notice. So part of it was simply that she notices the birds, um, but strangely, and I can't entirely explain this. When I came to write about Trothan, there often seemed to be bird-like images associated with him. So, for example, I don't know if you remember the bit where he's on the balustrade of her decking, um, and he's walking along the top of it, and there's something quite bird-like about the way he does that. And likewise, he often appears with feathers caught in his hair and that kind of thing. And I think for me, some of that was simply that he's quite a feral child, and so he became a bit associated with the wild creatures of the place, which are there mostly birds and seals, of
Okay.
course. But yeah,
Oh, there was one part in the book where the bird attacks Maggie. Did
yeah.
you possibly have an occurrence like that happen since you were talking about how you recognized that there were a lot of birds?
It's never happened to me, but these birds, the Arctic tern, they are vicious when they're nesting, and it's normally a very bad idea to walk through a nesting area of Arctic terns.
Okay.
Um, And the thing about that incident is that it comes at a time when she's just about beginning to feel more at home in the place, and that she's at kind of peace with it, and then it seems to turn on her through the birds. So that it's as if the birds are kind of the place. They kind of represent a live aspect of the place, and at that point they seem to her to turn on her as if she doesn't understand the place after all.
Okay. Well, all right. Well, that answers my question. So thank you.
Thanks.
Hi, I'm Angel.
Hi, Angel.
I had a question. Your story kind of pushes the folds fantasy just a little bit with the Selkies, and I was wondering what kind of research did you do into that, and what inspired you to take that direction?
Mm. Um, this area of Scotland. I don't know if you've been to Scotland, by the way. Can you put your hand up if you've been to Scotland? Oh, quite. Oh, that's great. Good. Oh, well, I'd love to ask you more about that. But this area of Scotland, it is quite a kind of, as you'll have gathered, quite a wild area. But it is also very rich with these quite unusual stories. And so when I was starting to write this novel, and I spent time in the place, the landscape kind of spoke to me, but so did the stories of the place. And there are a great many Selkie stories that come from that north coast of Scotland. But there was one in particular, um, which is actually from the very place that I'm writing about, which I decided to use as a kind of template for my story, but that I would retell it in a contemporary setting. So shall I tell you the story?
Yes, yes.
So that the original story, and it is quite different, and there are different versions of it, was that there were a couple who lived just near this village of Castletown, which is the real name of the place, and they, in some versions of the story, they were childless, and in some versions of the story, they just stopped having children and they wanted another one. But let's say they were childless, and they were really getting quite desperate. And with this, they were becoming quite poor. They were farmers, and they were becoming quite poor. And the man, had a dream, and in the dream he was told that what he needed to do was to walk the length of Dunnet Sand and back every morning before dawn for a year, and then his problem would be answered. And sure enough, a year and a day in, he finds a bundle on the beach, and the bundle is a seal skin with a baby inside it, which they adopt as if it's their own. And then it's a girl, actually, not a boy, and she grows up until she's about 12, I think, she's slightly older, and then one day she's in the church, the whole community are in the church, which is St. Trothan's Church, as it was, and she starts laughing, shrieking with laughter, and the minister stops the service and demands to know what she's laughing at, and she says, I'm looking at the devil who's up in the rafters. And in one version of the story, he's making a list of all the people who are asleep in the church. And in another version, which is the one that I went with, he's making a list of all the sins of the villagers. And she said he's just, the list is too long, he just can't, can't finish the list. And she's excommunicated from the church because of this. And then the story only continues a bit longer into her life. She becomes ostracised from the community because she's excommunicated from the church. But she does marry, but she dies in childbirth. So I've obviously taken huge liberties with that story, but certain aspects of it really spoke to me. And the thing about the Selkie stories is that they're kind of about people that don't quite fit. If you actually take them in a kind of metaphorical sense, they're potentially about characters who have a kind of temporary existence in a place or as a human, and then will go back somewhere, which I find I'm quite interested in the whole idea of exile. So to me, that was a really kind of interesting place to explore. But of course, I also intended that there could be a way of reading the novel which didn't have that Selkie, it just had the Selkie story as a metaphor rather than an explanation for Trothan. And I can't remember now what your original question was, so I'm not sure if I've answered it properly.
Research, and it's interesting.
Oh, research, sorry, yes, research. Yes, so I did do quite a bit of research. I mean, that story was very readily available by library research and quite a lot of internet research. But there's a very good book called People of the Sea, and this was written by, if you hold on 1 minute, I think I can lay my hands on it. Sorry, I couldn't find it. Anyway, it's written by a man who travelled all over Scotland and Ireland, I think in the 1950s, and he recorded a great many Selkie stories from all those parts. And they have lots of consistencies between the Selkie stories, but some intriguing differences as well. So that was one of my main sources. And of course, there's lots and lots of traditional Selkie stories which you can find quite easily. And it does seem to be quite interesting. At the moment, there's a lot of children's stories coming out of, I guess, probably mostly from Scottish writers, which have Selkies in them as well. I don't know if any of you have read Orkney by. It'll come to me what her name is, but that's a book that came out about 6 months before mine, which also has a Selkie theme. That's adult fiction.
Thank you. I appreciate it.
Great.
I know that last week they had a discussion, and he actually pulled up that very story that you were telling us about the.
Did you? Yes.
Pilgrim Strait.
Yeah. Yeah, and it is quite interesting because in the graveyard there is this strange grave, which seems to be. I've remembered who wrote Orkney. It's Amy Sackville, and it's quite an interesting version of a Selkie story, actually. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Scotia.
Hey.
Something I noticed was that you have quite a knack for taking normal sights like birds flying and turning them into something odd, like when you wrote They Fly Underwater. These elements seem like things in surrealistic art or paintings. Were you inspired by surrealistic pieces in any way?
Not particularly. No. I think I'm quite interested in observation. I mean, my writing always starts with concrete observation, quite often in landscape, but also of people. But I'm quite interested when there appears to be an almost kind of supernatural or mythical element to something that's quite a concrete observation. So, I kind of find things that are marvelous in nature, like birds that fly underwater. I find them very intriguing. And again, I suppose it was a way of showing that Maggie's having to learn quite a lot. She doesn't really know that much about the things that aren't on the surface. So there's a whole thing about the layering of the map, but also the layering of things that can't be seen. And Troffan's very aware of the things that can't be seen, whereas she's not initially, and learns that through him. So I guess that's why I can see what you mean about it being surreal, but I don't think that was exactly what brought me to it, was the surreal element of it.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, I'm Anna.
Hey.
One of the scenes that we discussed quite a bit in class is the scene at the school where Trothan is presenting his map, and at the very end of that, when he pulls out this gun suddenly and he's surrounded, he's seen laughing, and we were sort of wondering collectively about why that particular detail of his laughter was included and what it means.
I think for him it's a bit of a victory, really, because he's getting a chance to expose what he sees as wrongdoing in the community, and I think he's excited by it. And the gun's not loaded, but obviously nobody knows that. He's found it, and he knows that the connection to Jim, who he thinks has been at the root of the death of the seal or possibly other seals. So it's his way of kind of getting his own back, if you like, and there's a sort of hilarity for him, I think, in achieving that, because normally he's kind of he's excluded a lot and he's not taken that much notice of, so he's finally having his opportunity to show people up. I think there's also an element of him just being a boy about it. It's just like he doesn't realise completely the seriousness of the situation.
Okay, thank you.
Does that answer your question?
Yes, it does.
Hello again.
Hello.
Okay, I have a question about the connection of death and motherhood. Um, there's a lot of hints at different types of mothers and Maggie's perspective of them. And I was wondering, is this based on any internal drama from your life, or is this based on something that you know, just researched, or you just said, I'm kind of interested in playing with that, or is there any
Hmm.
connection?
I think I was quite interested in motherhood as a concept for women who don't have children. Um, and I think the extent to which Maggie becomes quite obsessed with Trothan is probably a reflection of the fact that she hasn't had children. Um, and she almost thinks that she could be a better mother than Nora because she's taking more notice of the child, and she's kind of failed to understand what Nora can understand about the child, that he needs a lot of freedom, and that's the way to love him, is to actually give him freedom. So to the extent that I'm kind of interested in how women who are childless judged, I guess I was quite interested in that. But the other thing that interested me, one of the books that I read, coming back to research, this book here, can you see that? It's a geography book, and it's called Space and Place by, I don't know how to pronounce the name properly, but Wai Fu Chuan, I think. And it's a really, to me, because I'm very interested in place and landscape in all my writing, this was a very interesting book to read when I was thinking about the ideas behind Call of the Undertow. And one of the things that he says at some point, he goes into quite an exploration about how children attach to place. And the whole thing is about how your concept of space becomes a sense of place, which I guess is what happens to Maggie, really. But one of the things that he talks about there is the mother and the kind of key place for a child being the core anchors for a child. So the mother and the place where a child becomes familiar with are almost the same thing, and I find that quite fascinating. So I was quite intrigued by the idea that Trothan's attachment could be more to the place than it could be to his mother, or even equal. So to that extent, I think I was interested in the idea of mothering. And I guess, my own background, I was brought up, my father died when I was very young, I had no memory of him, and so I was brought up for quite a number of years by a single mother with 3 young children, who was, under quite a lot of pressure. And I guess that's made me quite aware of the difficulties of mothering, especially for a woman on her own. And obviously Nora's not on her own, but she's got a very complicated child mother.
I love the development of both Nora as well as Maggie, because there's because when you see the perspective of Nora, you're like you're on Maggie's side, and then it's towards the end that you really connect with her for the first time and sympathize with her character, and I really appreciate that development within her. So that's why I was
I
curious about motherhood.
I appreciate you appreciating it, because that was what I intended, was that Maggie would almost demonize her as a kind of negligent mother, but actually she's kind of misunderstood, really, and that really in the end they have quite a lot in common. But Maggie had completely overlooked this and thought that she was a kind of bad, bad negligent mother.
Thank you.
Hi, other than the obvious connection of Trothan's name with St. Trothan's Church, is there any other underlying connections that go along with the names of the characters?
I did quite deliberately choose Maggie's surname, which you pronounce it Tame, as in the river. Well, the river Thames is obviously pronounced in a slightly different way, but it means dark, and I felt that there was something appropriate about that. and also the connection with the name of the river seemed to connect her with the south of England. But interestingly, somebody who wrote a review of it connected her name with Tame without the H, which I thought was very interesting because she's coming from a tame, arguably a tame place into a wild place. So that was entirely accidental, but quite a nice accident, if that does work. I'm just trying to think of the other names. No, the other names are sort of more, when I think of a character, they kind of just get a name in the end. It's quite important to get their names quite quickly, including surnames, I think. But I didn't design any of the names apart from Maggie's and Trothan's to have any particular connection. And Gilbertson is a very common surname in that part of Scotland.
All right then, thank you.
Hi, I'm Victoria.
Hi, Victoria.
Hi. In regards to names, we learned that the archaic version of truth is trough. If Trothan, we're wondering collectively if he picked that name and his actions to kind of have that meaning of showing truth in the community, especially with the interactions of the community. One of the scenes we found particularly interesting was at the school function. The community members were kind of separate in themselves and didn't really interact with anyone. And with the map that he presented, it kind of showed the truths of the community with the different sections and the slaves. So we were just wondering if that had any representation or symbolism.
I hadn't intended any connection with truth or trough at all, but that's a very interesting connection. I really called him that because of the name of the saint, who is kind of thought to be a sort of patron saint of Caithness. So I wanted him to be very connected to the place. And the name was chosen because of that. But that's a really interesting connection that you've drawn, which I might adopt that and say that I did it on purpose.
Thank you. Oh, what is Castletown like?
Well, Castletown, I wish I could show you some photos actually. Castletown is, I hope, quite like how I described Quarrytown. But of course, Quarrytown is my version, so I have changed some elements, and it's my interpretation, and the community is entirely different. But Castletown is a small town. It's probably about, I'm guessing, about 1,500 people live there, and it is quite close cottages, which were lived in by the quarriers at the time when they were quarrying the slate there. It's a bit of a forgotten backwater. If you grew up there as a young person, I'm pretty sure you would want to leave. There's not very much going on. You know, there's one pub, there's a beach, a primary school. People have to travel quite a long way from there to go to a high school. Yeah, it's probably, from a young person's point of view, it's not a very exciting place, but it has this tremendous sense of space. And it's probably considered quite a safe place, by kind of modern standards. So it would be the sort of place where parents would probably quite happily let their children roam about a bit, to some extent, not as much as Trothan does, but to some extent they would. There are hazards, but they would be a lot fewer than in urban areas.
My name is Bailey.
Hi, Bailey.
And I really liked the way you blended like a little bit of fantasy into there, like Angel said earlier, in just a really subtle way. And I guess I just wanted to know like why you decided to put fantasy in there, but so subtly.
In the first version, my first draft of this novel, I made the supernatural explanation of Trothan's presence there quite explicit, and I didn't try and give an alternative reading. And I realised that it was quite important that you could read it in a naturalistic way as well. Because I was interested in the idea of a kind of traditional mythic story happening in a contemporary setting. But I don't know if any of you will have read Henry James's Turn of the Screw, which is a ghost story, but it has this interesting path that it treads, and it's a very tricky one, between an explanation. It's about a governess who's looking after two children. It's a Victorian story, and she begins to suspect that there's a sort of strange collusion between the children and two past members of the staff of the household who died, and she thinks that there's some kind of strange collusion going on. Anyway, I won't tell you the whole story because I hope you'll read it at some point. It's a novella, it's quite short. But the clever thing about the story is that you're never quite sure. She takes her suspicions to quite an extreme, and you're never quite sure whether she's projecting this onto the children or whether there really is a kind of haunting connection there or not. And I wanted to achieve something a little bit similar to that, so that it could be read as having an entirely naturalistic explanation, or it could be read as having a supernatural explanation. And that is quite, it was a slightly tricky balance to achieve, because I didn't want, for example, I know one person who read it with no understanding of what a selkie was. She'd never even heard of a selkie. And she just read it as a completely naturalistic story, and she was very sad that Trothan disappeared, but she accepted that version of the story. Whereas somebody who reads a supernatural version of it might feel that there's kind of more redemption in it. But I wanted there to be more than one reading of it. So I'm always quite interested to see how people receive it, and particularly the ending. Have I answered your question?
Yeah, that was really good and really cool the way you blended the two.
Hi, my name is Sarah.
Hi, Sarah.
I was curious, another question about your research. Did you by any chance come across male Selkie lore? Because, yeah, we did some research about Selkies and we came across male ones that were described a lot like Trothan, and we found that really interesting.
I think more often the Selkie is a woman who comes ashore and gets trapped by a man who takes her skin from her. That's more common as a story, but there are definitely male Selkies. I did check that out because I was a bit worried that I was inventing a new creature, but there definitely are male Selkies who presumably get trapped by women who steal their skins.
Well, in the article we read about male Selkies, there was this particularly interesting part that talked about how the male will come ashore and form a relationship with a woman and heal her heart. And that was very interesting to us. And we were wondering if you'd come across that and worked that in.
No, I hadn't come across that, but that's very interesting. Yeah. I think there's any number of versions of Selkie stories actually, so you can probably kind of read into it what you want, because I think there's another story which says that their Selkies are actually the souls of drowned fishermen that have inhabited the seal, and of course they're usually men. Yeah. I wondered if you might like me to read any sections from the novel.
Hi, my name is Christy.
Hi, Christy.
In the final scene between Nora and Maggie, Nora accuses Maggie of having vanity, and then Maggie immediately connects it to motherhood, but later on connects it to a physical vanity as well. Could you talk a little bit about how that affects the character of Maggie with her own personal vanity as a woman?
I think the vanity that Nora is alluding to is the vanity of having made something of Trothan and his map-making abilities for her own glorification. So Nora's really accusing her when she enters him for a competition that she's actually interested in her own, in glorifying herself, and particularly by pretending to be his mother. And the thing about the kind of physical vanity is, of course, the fact that she was looking in the mirror at the point when she had the accident, and that's the thing that's hardest for her to admit to. And I thought it was quite. I thought there was. I don't know how you pictured Maggie, but I pictured her as being quite in denial about her appearance. So, you know, she has her hair cut short, and then she doesn't want to look at the mirror. She just wants to accept how she looks. And so she's kind of trying to deny that vanity. And I imagine that by the end, when she's kind of healed a bit, that would change. Because she's actually been able to admit to that moment of vanity and the terrible consequences, and that she'll allow herself to look in the mirror again and consider her appearance. But there are kind of various points where she almost takes an interest in what she's going to wear and then doesn't quite do it.
My name's Mary. I was intrigued with your title for the book. Was that hard to determine?
No, I had terrible trouble with the title. In fact, I've got pages in my notebook. I've got pages and pages of possible titles, and I had actually finally decided. The working title was the Something Tide. I'm just trying to remember what it was. I'll look it up. The Something Tide. It was kind of connected with the tide turning. And I wasn't quite satisfied with it. I liked the idea of there being sea imagery in the title. And then I hit upon Undertow, and that seemed to me exactly the right idea, because it's about a draw, and Maggie being drawn to the place, being drawn to Trothan. There's a lot of kind of almost irresistible impulses there. So Undertow seemed right. And what I decided I wanted was a one-word title, which was just Undertow. And my publisher said, absolutely not, can't have that. So I was very upset for a bit. And he gave me 24 hours to come up with an alternative. And the other idea that I'd had was something like The Call of the Tide or The Call of the Sea. And then he said, well, what about The Call of the Undertow, combining the two ideas? And I said, okay, we'll just go with that. And actually, I've ended up really liking it. There was one suggestion that it was slightly tautological, because the Undertow has a pull and the Call has a pull, so there's kind of two pulls in there. But I wasn't too worried about that, actually, and I think the thinking of the publisher, and I think he was quite right, actually, was that it's more poetic. If you've got a one-word title, it tends to indicate a thriller or a crime novel, whereas the longer title suggested with a slightly more poetic ring to it suggested a more literary work, which is what we were aiming for.
Would you like to go ahead and read?
Yeah. Any requests, or shall I just choose a couple of passages?
Which is your favorite section of the novel?
I'll tell you what. I'll read from when Maggie first meets Trothan down at the harbour wall. So it's the first time they've properly met. She's seen him at the school, in the school playground, but she's not spoken to him before. And this is on her. We're on page 42. It's when she's taking her walk to the beach on a Sunday, and she comes across him at the harbour. A small figure stood on the pier, As she approached, she could see that the wellies following the wall's edge, almost overhanging it, were flowery. She hesitated, thinking she might still retreat, turn back for the open beach where she'd intended to go next anyway, where anonymity was guaranteed. But the head turned, and she saw that the child was holding a pad of paper and a pencil. She walked to the end of the pier, admiring the stretch of blue ahead of her and the starburst splashes of gannets diving. She turned, expecting to find a face buried in concentration, but although his hand was still poised over the paper, an amused, quizzical look was turned directly on her. "Lovely day," she said, a ridiculous thing to say to a child. "Where's your GPS?" "I don't really need it here," she laughed. "You're not making a map?" "Not today. It's Sunday." "I am." The child turned the face of his pad towards her, an invitation which drew her in to look over his shoulder. When she got close to him, she noticed his hair. It was almost damp-looking, as if it had dried with salt water in it. She remembered that feeling from her family holidays in Cornwall. She stepped away slightly, but could still see the page. It held a spider's web of fine pencil line. Despite the markings and remarkings, she could see that it was a bird's-eye representation of the Quarrytown end of the bay. "Gosh," she said, stepping closer again despite her own resistance. "Have you done that just by standing there?" "Here, sorry. I went up there too." He pointed behind them to the small rise of Ulrich Hill with its mast. "Yes," she said, "you get a great view." When she went up, she'd seen the butt head of Dunnet lying along the horizon, and noticed how even the slight elevation widened the bay into a shiny apron in front of it. The boy looked up at her. "Did you hear any pipes?" "Pipes? Bagpipes?" "No." He went back to his drawing. "Why?" she asked. He giggled into his sketchbook. "There was a man called Peter Barker," he said. "He was up there with his cows and met a lady in a green dress." "When?" she asked. "I wasn't wearing a green dress." The boy laughed, his fringe tossing out of his squinting eyes. He'd fallen asleep for a moment amongst the flowers. She said he could have a Bible or the pipes. "Ah, I see." "And he chose?" "The pipes. He didn't know he could play them, but it turned out he could. His cows did a wee dance when he started to play." Maggie smiled. "A happy ending, then." "Except he had to go back and meet her in the same place 7 years later." Uh-oh, she sensed the story was about to take a bad turn. The boy looked up, didn't continue immediately. "And did he ever return home?" "No," said the boy. "That's a very sad story, then." The boy turned his head up to her, one eye piercing the gap in his straggling fringe. "Why?" "Well, for his family, his friends, never to see him again." The boy shrugged. She was very beautiful. She smiled to herself, as if that made his removal from their lives a small thing to accept. He went on, pointing ahead towards the house that dominated the long flat sward leading out to Dunnet Head. "And I went up there too." "You've been busy." She wondered if this had all been in response to her talk. Flattering as it might be, it seemed rather an extreme response. "That was how you said they did it," he said, taking sightings from the highest places around. "Well, yes." She looked at his map again and pointed. "This here, that's the old RAF airfield." "Might not be quite right yet. I need to look from Inkstack. Then I'll draw it in properly." "With a pen?" "Aye." She grinned at the child. "Well done." He looked back at her as if unsurprised at his own abilities. "And your mum and dad, have they taken you to all these places to get your data?" "No." "So?" No answer came. She imagined the distances involved for a child of about 9. It seemed a serious endeavour. "Do you have a bicycle?" "Sort of." "Oh?" "Well, it's my dad's really, but he doesn't often use it." She could see he wasn't the sort of child who'd be mucking about jumping puddles on his bike with the other boys, or worrying about where he was going to get designer trainers from. "You stay in Flotsam Cottage, don't you?" he said suddenly. She didn't reply. He was a child. There should be boundaries, and that word "stay" nibbled. She knew by now that its sense in Scotland was live, but after 2 months she wasn't sure which she was, tourist or resident, or which she wanted to be. It's here. He pointed at their cottage on his map, tucked downhill from Sally's bungalow, drawn on his map in partial elevation. Just northeast of it was the sprawl of the derelict farm buildings. He looked up at her, the fringe swept aside to reveal his dark brown eyes. "Do you think it's right?" the boy asked. "What? The cottage? Should it be a bit more towards the main road here?" "Is it for school, this map? For your project?" He looked at her as if surprised at the question, and then just shrugged. "I can still move it." He took out a soft rubber to show her. "I'll look forward to seeing it when you're finished." "I'll bring it round." "I meant at the school." Her voice whipped out quick and hard, a defence, driving him beyond her walls and fences. She wished she understood kids better. Some, like her sisters, seemed easy to be with and knew their place. She never got anything confusing from them, but then they mostly ignored her and she them. She tried to make up some sort of ground. "Your parents must be proud of you. What do they do for jobs?" He looked ahead at the sea and the sky before answering. She noticed his profile now, how the forehead almost ran straight into the nose without the normal dip at its bridge, and how the chin jutted out following the same single line. It was an odd face, flat and almost ugly as well as beautiful. There seemed something of the Arctic about him, some resemblance to semi-people. "Dad's a truck driver. He's away sometimes. Mum's in the reception at the doctor's." "And you've brothers and sisters?" "No," he said. "I was their only gift." Laughter jerked out of her. "Is that what they call you?" "Sorry." It was such an odd way for a child to explain his own existence, and yet there seemed not a touch of irony in it. He half shrugged. "You've an unusual name," she said. "How do you know?" he asked. When she failed to answer, he asked, "What's your name again?" She hesitated at his directness, but then she had been direct in her questions to him. "I'm Maggie." "The map lady," he said. His eyes were unblinking through his fringe. She stepped back. "See you," she said. "See you at the school." Then she turned and walked quickly away, wobbling slightly on the uneven cobbles. And I think that's an example of how Maggie finds Trothan. She's attracted to him, but she's also quite unsettled by him, and she's never quite sure whether she's quite unnerved. I think quite often by him because he's quite unknowable. He's difficult to understand for her, and there's quite a sense that he could be not a force for evil exactly, but a sort of, not a kind of positive force. And yet other times she's completely charmed by him, which was one of the things that I wanted to kind of feel about him, was that he had this kind of slight duality about him. Any more questions from me?
Hi. This question isn't as much about the book as it is your creative process. How do you know when the book is finished? After all those drafts and all that work, how do you have that it is finished feeling?
Yeah, good question. I added up the number of drafts I did of this novel, and it was something like 13 or 14 quite serious redrafts. And it was done in stages, and the last 3 were done after I was with the publisher and I had an editor. I didn't think that it was completely finished when I submitted it to my agent, and when she submitted it on to publishers. But I thought it was pretty close, and it ended up being not as close as I thought it was, in the sense that I wasn't completely happy with the chapter division. I wanted there to be more tension at the end of each chapter. the editor's main comments were about description following the pace, and I did want it to have a good pace. So I was pretty ruthless in the final few drafts with cutting out any description that was only there to describe. If it wasn't doing anything else, like telling you something about a character or furthering the plot in some way, I did try to be quite ruthless about that, because I know I can be a bit wordy about description. And mainly it was really tightening. It was about kind of tightening things. Some little things needed a bit more playing out to show their significance. And I guess the final way that I really know that something's finished is when the title comes together, which, as I've said, was very late in the day, and when I can read the whole thing aloud and the language reads well aloud, and I'm not kind of going, oh, I'm not falling over words or feeling that something is breathless or poorly expressed. So the reading aloud stage is really important to me. So by the time I actually finally submitted the version that was going to be published, I did feel satisfied that it was finished in a way that I haven't always felt with some of my short stories. When I've come to read them in public, I've still wanted to cross words out and alter things when I read it, and so that indicates to me that they weren't entirely finished.
As a professional writer, do you have any advice for the young writers that are here?
I guess that one bit of advice that's often given is write what you know, and I don't really agree with that. I think that writing is about the use of imagination. This sounds like a contradiction. When I write about places, I do like to have been to places, and I like to really connect with them in quite a visceral way. It's usually by walking a lot, but I like to really feel the place. I have a sort of process that I call walking a place into my bones, which is just kind of a lot of repeated walkings in different conditions and different weathers. And very often that's a way of kind of generating ideas for me, and generating storylines is actually walking. But I do think that writing is about taking imaginative leaps, and I enjoy writing with a male narrator. Something I couldn't possibly know what it's like to be a man, but I really enjoy it because it then becomes very clear that it's not me. And I enjoy writing from the point of view of people of different ages as well. So I would encourage you to kind of treat it as a bit of an adventure and a discovery, particularly in your first draft, and not to be afraid of rewriting, because to me it's the rewriting where you discover kind of what you're wanting to say in the early draft, but it's in the rewriting that you really deliver it, and it's a fantastically rich process if you can really pursue that. I think sometimes some of the workshops that I do, particularly in schools, we only ever get a chance to do a first draft, and I think that's quite sad, because a lot of the joy is in actually redrafting and polishing and finding what you really want to say. And my top tip, how many of you are writing short stories? You put your hand up if you're writing short stories. Yeah. My top tip with a short story is when you get to the stage where you think, not quite sure exactly what I'm writing about here, is to write the story as a haiku. I think you'll be familiar with the haiku, which is this tiny poetic form of 3 lines, 5 syllables, 7 syllables, and 5 syllables. And if you can't write the meaning of your short story in a haiku, you probably don't quite know what it's about yet. But if you can do it, it gives you then a kind of logic for editing it, because anything which doesn't subscribe and further along that haiku idea, in a short story it probably shouldn't be there, because you have to be so focused in a short story. So that's my top tip.
Right, thank you.
Hi. Was there any character that went into a different direction than you originally planned or kind of took on life as its own?
Graham changed quite a lot in the course of rewriting the novel. He, in the early drafts, he didn't play a particularly significant part, but I realised he was going to be quite important to Maggie, because she did need to have a friend there who was kind of, she could relate to. And he was also somebody who knew the place very well, but in a very different way to Trotman. Um, and he took on a bit more of a sense of humour as the drafts developed. He became, I mean, he's got a really bad sense of humour, but he has got a sense of humour. And that was quite important to balance her seriousness, I think. But he did take on, I got to like him a lot more. I think in my early drafts, I wasn't altogether sure that I liked Graham that much. He kind of smelt of cigarettes and was a bit boring about birds, but he got more fun, and he was certainly a very good friend to her by the time I'd finished with him. But it is interesting because I do find, as I read draft stories, the characters can end up behaving in slightly different ways. They don't necessarily deliver the plot as you want them to deliver it. They kind of can end up changing the plot because of the way that they behave, and I think that's right important, that characters should have the liberty to do that.
Thank you.
Kind of piggybacking on that question, before you started this book, did you already have the story in mind? Did it like come to you and you decided to write about it, or did you have it mapped out, or did you just start writing, and what was the process?
Yeah, it was. As I say, I did kind of choose this traditional story as a bit of a template, but obviously I had to think in advance about who the contemporary characters would be. And the thing was that some of the things that had already been inspirations for it were something that happened quite a long time ago. A friend of mine who lives in the same village as me has a son, and when he was 6, he drew a map of the village, and it's absolutely extraordinary. It's you wouldn't believe that a 6-year-old could do this. And he mapped the streets just by walking along them, and he'd drawn them partly, some of them are bird's eye view and some of them are in elevation, and it's an extraordinary map. It's very accurate, but also very beautiful, and that really struck me because I love maps. I'm very interested in maps, so that was extremely intriguing. And then I'm interested in the history of map making, and I'd heard about this map maker called Timothy Pont, who was one of Scotland's earliest map makers, and he walked all over Scotland in the 17th century at a time when it must have been really difficult to do that. And when I was thinking about my setting, I knew that I was going to write it in this particular place in Caithness. It was a complete coincidence that I discovered that Timothy Pont had been a minister in the church that done it, and I thought, well, this is fate intervening. I'm obviously intended to put all these things together. So as it's quite typical of my process that a number of things will just coincide at the right time, and I know that they've got some relationship to each other, but I don't know exactly what it is. I didn't map out very much at all because I had the security of the original story to follow. And I'd already decided that I couldn't use the church in the traditional story. This Selkie girl exposes the community by the devil making his list, and I knew I couldn't use the church because in a contemporary Scottish community, by and large, people don't go to church, so it wouldn't act as a kind of hub for the community, whereas the school would. So I chose the school as the focus, and then it made sense that as a cartographer coming to the area, she might well get invited in to, because quite often schools here will draw upon local expertise to enhance the curriculum, and that made sense that they would do that. And the way that I did it, and I don't write full time, I have quite a busy freelance life, teaching creative writing and doing various residencies and things. So I knew it wasn't going to be realistic for me to sit down and spend a month writing full time to get a first draft. But I very quietly, I didn't tell anyone I was writing this novel because I'd written a novel before and it wasn't very good. And I was beginning to think I'm actually probably really a short story writer and not a novelist, but I thought I'll give it one more go, but I'm not going to tell anyone I'm doing it. So I just wrote for an hour a day, and I wrote in a very uncensored way. So I wrote continuously for an hour. I didn't reread anything, I didn't change anything, I just accepted that what I had written was not going to be very good. There would be lots of things in it that would never be used, but I'd got something down, and in 3 months I had a very crude and not very good first draft, which I could then work into. And it, as I've already said, it changed enormously in the redrafting, but it was a great feeling of confidence to have something down on paper. I write with a pen because I'm very bad at typing and I can write quickly with a pen. I've got a kind of fountain pen with real ink that I like to use. I make a lot of mess, and I would just pick up, the next day I would just pick up from where I'd left off and just start again. Obviously I'd have some idea of where it was going, but I didn't always exactly know where it was going to go, and then just set off again. So it really was quite an exploratory draft. And of course the downside of that is that you can waste quite a lot of time with this draft that's not particularly good quality and may not be the story that you exactly want to tell because you might go off at a tangent. But it helped me a lot to have a first draft, which was only about 50,000 words, but I could start working into it, deciding what was wrong with it, building on it, and reiterating what was there. I'm a very slow writer as a result of that process.
I think we all are. Did you have any questions for us?
I'd love to know, well, two things I'd love to know is that Cheryl told me that you had a discussion about liminality, and I'd love to know a bit about how you applied that to Call of the Undertow. Does that ring bells?
It is. It's just it was a while ago, so we've kind of got to think back to it.
Oh, okay. Yeah.
You caught us on the spot.
I'll ask you the other question because it'll be much easier, which is I was interested how you came across Call of the Undertow in the first place. Probably a question for Cheryl.
You know the I think it's called the Scottish Imp.
Yes.
Yeah, I think I saw a review of it.
Yeah. Oh, yeah, they did review it. That's right. Yeah. Oh, that's great. I'm delighted.
It's a good review.
Yeah. Uh-huh.
Now that I have the microphone,
Yeah. Yeah.
I wanted to ask a couple of questions. One is, it seems like the book has at least 3 places involved. It's got Oxford, it's got the Caithness region, and it's got Lagos. And it has Cornwall. Cornwall's referenced anyway. I was wondering, especially, whether you're thinking about making some kind of relationship between those places, or especially with Lagos, what you were trying to, why introduce it? You know, why not have another sort of UK reference that you know Maggie was working on? Why have that reach?
Yeah. That location was kind of serving several purposes. I mean, one was making her job realistic because that, as a freelance cartographer, that was quite a realistic task that she would have been asked to do, to provide an atlas for schools in another country or another continent. And what I really wanted it to show was her own dissatisfaction with her knowledge of place through her map making, in contrast to Troffan's. When he was very physically present, he really knew the place and its stories and all its layers, and all she'd got was received information about Lagos. But her battle to try and express it in a similar style to the style that Troffan would have used, so more through metaphor, picture, the idea of a kind of story map, I suppose, and making kind of story out of Lagos. And I kind of wanted to suggest at the end that she would want to go there, because she really felt she should go and feel it rather than just receive the information about it. So it needed to be somewhere that was quite distant, and somewhere in Africa suited my purposes, because there was this kind of connection. It was only a small thing really, but it was a connection between the church bell at Dunnet, which had been presented through a connection with the slave trade, and the West Africa kind of fitted in quite nicely with that theme as well. But that was only a small thing really. It was more that I wanted to show that, her kind of modern cartography was rather inferior in some ways to Troffan's really felt cartography, and she had no way of accessing what she needed to do justice. And then Oxford, the main role that Oxford has is to be somewhere that's really, really different, and that she actually felt quite at home there, and is bound to find Caithness entirely alien and bleak and surprising and unnerving, but also quite exciting after a time. And that she really exiles herself there, because there's not much on the map, which is kind of the irony of it in comparison to Oxford. The kind of contrast of position on the map and also a very different, utterly different kind of place felt important to me.
I was wondering whether, this concept of rooted cosmopolitanism, have you heard anything about that?
I haven't heard of it as a term.
Yeah, sort of the discourse around transnational novels and so forth, and trying to find some way to have a grounded local knowledge that's not parochial or provincial, but also have an awareness, a global awareness that isn't shallow. Right? It sort of seemed like the novel was sort of traveling in those waters, as it were.
Yeah. Well, that's quite interesting. One of the books that I read when I was working on it, which didn't have a direct influence, but I found it interesting in relation to it, was Michelle de Cresne's Questions of Travel. I don't know if you know it. She won the book won the Australian Women's Fiction Prize. I've forgotten what it's called now. About 3 years ago, I think. And there's an Australian woman in it who travels a lot, and she travels kind of without a real purpose. It's just to be in different places and to live in different places. But there's another character, and eventually their stories do coincide, who's from Thailand, and he's been, he and his family have been horribly victimised, and he has to become a refugee and escape the country, and so he's forced to move to Australia. He needs to get away somewhere, and he's helped to move there. And there's a part of the story is about the way that he gradually becomes adopted and adopts Australia and his patch of Australia as a kind of home, and is accepted and accepts it. And one of the expressions that she uses in it, which I really loved, was that he walks and walks and walks to get to know the place, and she says walking is porous, and I just love that idea, and it's something that I feel when I walk, that it's porous, and I somehow feel that I've got to a place by walking in quite a lot of depth. But of course, you know, that's a bit different to what you're saying, because you would need to be there in order to do that. So having the in-depth knowledge of the place without going to it is problematic for me, I think.
Okay, another question I had, thank you for answering that one, is about whether you know if you have readers in Castletown of your novel, and if so, how they responded to the book.
I don't know is the honest answer. I did a launch of the novel in Thurso, which is about 6 miles from Castletown, and I'm not aware that anybody from Castletown came to it. And I was very nervous about it because I thought they might all hate me, and I might be hounded out of town. But actually, all the people that came to the book launch, of course they hadn't read the book yet, but they responded very positively, and I did have a few nice letters from people there afterwards. But I have no idea how people in Castletown responded. And it, you know, it would be interesting to know, but I'm a little bit worried by it. You know, not that, I mean, I would always make the point that that was, from my point of view, that was an entirely invented community. I used their geography without using their community. But I can see that if you live there, you might not interpret it like that. And there was one quite strange coincidence, which was quite late on in the process. I went to visit the local police station just to say, what would you do if there was this kind of child that was running away? And I didn't exactly need to do it because I'd had quite a close consultation with a community policeman in my own area, and he told me what he would do and what the rules said should be done. So I didn't exactly need to do it, but I just wanted to know if there was a different way that they might operate in that area. And they laughed when I told them the story, and they said, well, actually, there is a child in Castletown who keeps running away. Yeah, I felt a bit bad about that, but it was too late by then. The book was nearly done, so
I
yeah.
loved how you did the police characters in the novel. Reminded me of Fargo. Right? Have you seen that film?
Oh, yes, yeah. I love that film. Yeah.
Okay, do we have any more questions? Okay.
Hey again.
Right.
So I was curious as to which character you favored over the others, because for me, I really liked Graham. But I was just wondering if there was one character where you started writing that you thought would be your #1 favorite rooting for teen character, and then it might have changed to somebody else, or if it stayed throughout the entire novel.
I think I would have to say it's Maggie, because I spent so much time with her more than any of the other characters. I mean, I really like Trotham, and he's a little bit mysterious because I don't really feel that I invented him. I think he just materialised somehow. I don't recollect actually putting him together as a character. He just appeared from somewhere. He was slightly physically based on a child that I'd met when I was doing some work in the school, but it was only physical. It was just how he looked physically. It wasn't his character. But I think Maggie, I was worried that Maggie might be unlikable. But for me, that was probably one of the things that I liked about her, was that she didn't altogether like herself, and so she had to kind of come to terms with herself. So I found her journey quite a rewarding one, although it was very troubling. So she would probably be my favourite character.
Okay, thank you.
This year so far in our class, we've only focused on Scottish writers, and so I was wondering if you considered yourself a Scottish writer, and if so, does that have any meaning to you?
Yeah, that's a good question, because I'm not Scottish. I've lived in Scotland since 1990, so I have lived in Scotland for a long time. and I started to get involved in writing in 1995. So all my development as a writer has happened in Scotland, and I feel like I've been incredibly well supported by the kind of Scottish writing community. Because it's a small country, you connect very readily with other people that are doing things similar to you, whatever they are. And so I know a lot of other writers. There's very good support from some of the kind of grant-giving structures and bodies that exist to support writing. So I feel a great allegiance with Scotland and Scotland's writing, but at the same time I don't feel Scottish. So it's slightly contrary. I've often been referred to as a Scottish writer within Scotland. I don't know if I have been outside Scotland. And I guess the meaning it does have a bit of a meaning for me, because recently I was in the Czech Republic, and somebody put it to me that, and apparently it was something that one of their presidents had said, that a country that has no coastline and no mountains will have people that have no imagination, which I thought was rather brittle and unfair. But when I thought about it, I thought actually Scotland has an enormously long coastline and quite a lot of mountains, and I do think there is some connection between this kind of sense of landscape and space and quite a wild feeling. It's not really wild, but a wild feeling landscape and imaginative writing. So I do think there probably are some qualities of Scottish writing that can be defined, actually. Obviously, it tends to be famous more for the kind of gritty urban Welsh, and that's what people tend to know about. But I think there's quite an affinity with the landscape as well.
What was your opinion on the Scottish referendum? For it, against it, why?
I personally have found the whole process quite uncomfortable and quite divisive, and I would have preferred there not to have been the referendum personally. However, it happened, and I think it's still a bit of a muddle now to know what's going to happen next. There were lots of good arguments. For my mind, I was very undecided until quite late on, and for my mind, there were good points on both sides, and there was what we've ended up with is a definite call for change, which comes from both the no and the yes camp to some extent, I think. But I was concerned that to some extent independence was being used as a kind of it was a protest vote about what's happening with our government in London at the moment. But it was a decision that we were making which was going to potentially affect the next several centuries, which isn't not at the moment. And I was very taken with the arguments in favour of being closer to democracy, more justice, and so on. But I felt there was more than one possible way of addressing that, which wasn't necessarily through independence, and that there's also other parts of the UK who feel exactly the same sense of being disenfranchised from the London government and would like to have the opportunity to work with people in Scotland to create change. So I was quite divided myself about the question itself. And I think some of the division that's created is unfortunate. That's where I stand.
Thank you.
I should just alert you that I'm about to run out of battery, and I can very easily go and get the cable.
Well, I think we're about out of time here.
Okay.
How much? 5 minutes? Yeah. 2 minutes?
Yeah, a couple minutes.
Okay.
2 minutes.
Anything else?
I hope it'll last for 2 minutes. It's on the blink, but I hope
Okay.
it'll last that long.
Okay. Well, very quickly, I wanted to tell you what the class talked about when we mentioned liminality.
Oh, yes.
Since that seems to have slipped their mind. But we talked about Trothan especially being a liminal character, not really fitting in anywhere and being partly of the sea
Mm,
anyway,
mm,
sort of human and somehow not, or more than. Um, and
mm,
also Maggie as sort of an in-between character, in that she didn't really belong yet where she was, but didn't want to go back.
yeah.
Talked about the in-betweenness of the genre that you were working in, or the vein that you were exploring between the mythic
Mm,
and the realistic. So there were some ways
mm,
that we were trying to apply that concept.
mm. Very interesting. Thank you.
All right.
Yeah.
Well, I guess we should let you go, and I really appreciate your being with us and you're writing this
Well,
book.
pleasure.
You write more novels too? No?
I'm about to start on a new one.
Oh, good. We'll look forward to it. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much. Nice to meet you all. Bye bye.